I've always had a great interest in theme parks, even though for a long time I had not been to that many. I went to a few standard parks as a child, like Six Flags or Magic Springs, but I mainly went with my family to what we consider to be our home park, which is called Silver Dollar City in Branson, Missouri, a fantastic theme park themed to the 1800s, with a bit of some retrofuturism and steampunk hidden here and there. Even as a child, I was captivated by the detailed care that went into the theming there that wasn't found in your standard amusement parks. When I was around 7 years old, my family went to Florida to visit my friend Justin and his family, and that's when we had the opportunity to go to Magic Kingdom for the first time. That's when the idea of what a theme park could be flew right out the window. Some of my earliest memories are Peter Pan's flight, getting scared to death by the mirror ghosts at the end of the Haunted Mansion, and a cast member turning me down at extraterrestrial, telling my mom that I couldn't handle it, and I'll never forgive that cast member as long as I live. Either way, it sure left an impression on me. Fast forward almost 20 years and Disney Plus drops their best original series to date, The Imagineering Story, so I throw it on and I'm immediately hooked. Sometimes the specific interest you forgot you had lies dormant for a long time and then bubbles up, catching you off guard. This is one of those times. I start to scrape the surface of what I quickly realize is an ocean of lore, and suddenly I want to know everything, from daily operations to ride history to the real bullet hole in Haunted Mansion. Learning that there's an entire underground labyrinth beneath Magic Kingdom, I think is what put me over the top. I finished that series and then I discovered Defunctland, and the deep dive just kept getting deeper. You're telling me Walt threw crazy parties for his animators? There used to be a teen nightclub at Disneyland in the 80s? Don't even get me started on the opening of Euro Disneyland. Halfway through watching his videos, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. Disney World is not as crazy expensive as I thought if you stay off site and plan accordingly. It's really not that bad at all. So summer 2021, my girlfriend and I took the plunge and had a fantastic time, with all the parks exceeding our expectations. We returned in summer 2023, and that time we had a longer stay, so I got to take my time and really soak in everything and appreciate how so much comes together and flows so well, such as the monorail and ferry and the Omnimover ride system. Even the new mobile ordering, I was like, wow, this is actually working pretty well. It operates like a well-oiled grandfather clock. We got engaged on that trip, by the way, but at the beach, not the parks. The Disney adult allegations were already hard enough to beat. After that most recent trip, the hyperfixation continued. So I decided it would be fun to go through every single movie based on a Disney attraction and see how they compare to the ride. Notice I said movie because I'm not going to talk about that weird It's a Small World animated series or that cheapo green screen Muppets Haunted Mansion special. I'm going to go in chronological order by starting with Tower of Terror from 1997. Tower of Terror feels like a Disney Channel original movie before they were even a thing, as this aired on ABC during their Wonderful World of Disney block. Perhaps it's rose-tinted glasses, but those older Disney Channel movies had a sort of charm and coziness to them, and this movie really falls into that area for me, despite never having seen it growing up. We follow a tabloid photographer who shoots a lot of phony photos for cheapo, sleazy magazines, which immediately I was interested in because anytime I see those at the store, I always wonder who is actually behind those photos, and how do they not feel lame making up random garbage? I always thought maybe it was just camp and never meant to be taken seriously, but now when I see an 80-year-old grandma pouring their heart out over some AI image of a child somehow carving Michelangelo into the side of a tree, I'm reminded that it's actually not that far-fetched. Now this guy Buzzy, he ropes in his niece to help him get the shots that he needs, and she's played by Kirsten Dunst, which is a delight to see in a role in between Little Women and the Virgin Suicides. She pushes him to take on a real story for a change, after this creepy old lady Abigail shows up, asking him to take on the mystery that's been at the center of her whole life. He wants no involvement and takes the time to explain that all the stuff he works on is fake and he doesn't even believe in the paranormal. She tells them a story about how there was a party there on Halloween night 60 years ago, and how a child star and her entourage got on the elevator to head up to the top floor to the party, but disappeared when lightning struck. She blames the whole thing on an evil witch who was the nanny of the girl who placed a curse on her. There's a bit of resistance here, which I like. because I find him being this slimeball cynic who clearly just does this work for easy money and has very little integrity to be an interesting choice. But of course, after this, he gets convinced to do the story, and now he has to investigate the Hollywood Tower Hotel, which his niece wants to help with. The funniest part of this whole thing to me is that anytime we see an establishing shot of the hotel, it's just the actual theme park attraction, which I've been on a few times now, so it almost adds like a surreal element. And then when they're walking around the property, they have similar shots to what I shot when I was there that I did for a film project, so it makes it feel even more strange. So they figure out the place is really haunted, of course, and they figure out the grandma isn't exactly what she seems. And there's this whole part of the plot where he's trying to convince a woman he used to be romantically involved with, who works at a real company with integrity, that he's actually on a real story this time, and she doesn't believe him, and there's this sort of back and forth thing happening, because she's a control freak, and it goes on this whole time, and it's a bit annoying. Especially when we get to the obligatory part where she realizes, wow, there really is actually something paranormal going on, and she says, does anyone want to tell me what's going on here? Like, no, we already gave you 100 chances and you were a prick about it, so let's move on. Anyway, there are things I'm iffy on, like the fact that most of it takes place during the day. They should have utilized the nighttime a bit more instead of saving it, and I think the actors playing the ghosts should have maybe had some sort of ethereal effects to them. It's cool that they just stand around casually just like they would be alive, but it also feels very TV movie in this way, which I know that it is, but still, I don't know. Give me some sort of ghost effect or something, I don't know. We get some fun scares for the kids, and I like the finale of the movie well enough. Especially the scene where the elderly woman has to confront her sister who has never aged since she's a ghost. It's an interesting concept for a Disney TV movie, I'd say. Overall, this is decent family fare, and if you're already throwing on stuff like Halloween Town and Hocus Pocus during the Halloween season, then this one would fit right into that rotation.
Look out! It's Toad on the road! Look out, everybody! Whoa, what a beauty! Whoa, Christ!
This one is a bit iffy, because this British film is technically called Wind of the Willows, based on the novel, which of course the Disney movie that Mr. Toad's Wild Ride comes from is also based on. Here's the thing though, when Disney picked it up for US distribution, it renamed it to Mr. Toad's Wild Ride to make it a tie-in to the parks, so it's a tough call, since the ride is true to the source material and all. But when it came out on the US, it wasn't released until late '97 to a very small market, and then slapped onto home video in '98. So the film known as Mr. Toad's Wild Ride technically comes after Tower of Terror chronologically. This one is pretty decent, and it has a fair amount of charm to it. You could consider it almost a backdoor Monty Python film, as I was shocked to learn it was directed by Terry Jones and features performances by Eric Idle and John Cleese. It even has a bit of good dry humor thrown in with the more obvious gags. I thought it was a bit of an interesting stylistic choice to have them looking like humans but dressed in what animals might wear if they were anthropomorphic. But as soon as you get to Toad, he's got a long tongue and eat bugs, so I was kind of hoping they would lean more in with the low-budget theater aesthetic, but it's fine. I feel the film overall is a bit inconsistent, different scenes playing to different ages and whatnot, but there's some humor here that'll be funny no matter what your age. I will always enjoy the concept of Toad having the insatiable lust for driving like a complete maniac, and now that he's tasted it, he can't get enough. They treat this like a drug addiction in the movie, which is easily the best joke of the film. There's a point where they're having to keep him inside and watch over him so he won't relapse, only to find that he's ordered a dozen automobiles just so he can drive them and presumably crash them. There's also a really good courtroom scene with John Cleese and Stephen Fry that feels like a classic Python sketch, and if the whole film was as funny as this sequence, then it would be an all-timer classic. I was waiting the whole time for Mr. Toad to finally go on a true all-out rampage in the car, hoping that maybe it would end with him crashing and going to hell like in the Disney ride, but it never happens. Obviously I understand why it doesn't, but if it ended with Mr. Toad in hell, I would recommend the film to anyone no matter what. That's still the coolest ending to a Disney attraction, by the way.
Terry. We need you.
Mission to Mars was an attraction I had to actually look up before I watched it. before realizing it was the continuation of Rocket to the Moon, which is that original Tomorrowland attraction where everyone sits in a circle and experiences a simulated flight into space. Not to be confused with Mission Space, the Epcot attraction so intense I had to lie down afterwards. Mission to Mars actually closed in the early 90s, which makes it strange that Disney would want to use it as a template for a big budget space adventure movie. That's like if right now Disney decided they were going to make a movie based off of Maelstrom. When I saw that one of the movies I'd be watching was a Brian De Palma film, I was shocked. I had no idea that he'd made this movie, and I was excited to see what he would do within the sci-fi genre. Sadly, that excitement was quickly dashed when we were met with some of the clunkiest expositional dialogue I've ever heard in my life.
Nobody ever wanted Mars the way you two did. Not even Woody. You two were 12 years training for this thing, hoping for this assignment.
Well, that's all over now.
If Maggie hadn't gotten sick, if you hadn't pulled yourself out of the rotation to take care of her, I mean,
Luke.
No, Jim, wait a minute. I want to say this.
Surely there's a better way to set this all up. Anyway, Don Cheadle and his crew go to Mars and go looking for water, but end up finding some creepy face, clearly not made by humans. And then this big weird vortex thing shows up and kills everybody except for Don Cheadle. And there's actually a pretty fairly gory death in the scene, which was pretty cool because, the movie's PG-13, but I don't even think I can show it in this video. So anyway, the rest of the movie is about the rescue team that have to go and navigate Mars just to see what actually went wrong. And that rest of the movie is just okay. There's a few standout sequences, like when they have to abandon ship, and there's this resupply module that Tim Robbins' character tries to get to, but completely messes up and goes floating towards the atmosphere and they try to save him. But other stuff, like when they're just walking around the ship and it's rotating and it's supposed to be this fancy effect, is pretty standard to me. It's a lot of stuff you've seen before, especially in like 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was made in the 60s. And when you've seen 100 space movies though, I guess it's harder to find stuff that stands out. Maybe that's just me. It's probably a me problem. I don't know. A lot of the back and forth dialogue just isn't very interesting. And the one character they gave a tragic backstory in the way of being a widower just kind of falls flat. You really don't care that much. When they get to Mars, they find that Don Cheadle's character is still alive, and they figure out that the Martian DNA looks very similar to the human DNA, and this is supposed to be a big revelation. But it's just predictable, because you know what they're going for the whole time, just from the opening 20 minutes. I think the problem here is that perhaps the whole ancient astronauts thing was a bit fresher at the turn of the century, but it's old news now. It's been on the History Channel for 15 years at this point. So they make their way towards the giant face and they get inside, and it's clear from this point on that this is the part De Palma was looking forward to making the most. He gets to do his high concept extraterrestrial contact thing where the characters figure out that aliens started evolution on our planet, and we're all connected, and they're connected to us, and all that kind of stuff. Okay, cool. But like, if you've seen or read a lot of sci-fi, this is nothing fresh. What would have been cool is if we could have seen a bit of the widower's journey, as he's the one who decides to get in the alien transport at the end and witness the next stage of evolution or whatever they're going to show him. I want to see what they're going to show him. I know that's the point, it's like, wow, leave it up to the viewer's imagination, but at this point I've seen so many sci-fi movies, it's like, no, let me see some cool stuff, okay? I don't know. Anyway, it's a pretty okay sci-fi movie. Let's move on.
They're gonna tear down Country Bear Hall.
Tear down Country Bear Hall?
Yeah.
Tear down Country Bear Hall?
Yeah.
I was kind of dreading this one because as a child, it was one of the few films I truly hated. Now think about that for a moment. There are plenty of movies kids don't really like or care for, but that just means they won't really talk about it or watch it again. When does a kid ever come out and tell you that they outright hated it? I can think of two that I did this with. It was this and Son of the Mask, but that's another story. I have no idea why I despise this so much, but as I turned it on, I quickly realized that I couldn't 100% hate a movie where a bear does backflips, just on principle. And to be fair to the movie a bit more, the costumes and effects for the bears look pretty good, especially on the main kid. And I'll admit, I wanted to learn more about how their universe works. And if bears are sentient, then why do they use trackers on them in the woods like mentioned at the beginning of the movie? Are all bears sentient, or just some? These are questions that need answering. I'm glad for a lot of the bears they went with actual voice actors instead of random celebrities, like Kevin Michael Richardson, Toby Huss, and Stephen Root. The movie's not horrible, I'd just say it's a more straight down the line 5 out of 10 studio movie with all the cookie cutter family elements, including the one-dimensional cartoonish villain who wants to destroy Bear Hall for money, and the very basic plot of getting the band back together. It works great in The Muppets, but here, not so much. The issue is that the whole plot is that they go find one bear, there's a mediocre song they sing, the bear joins up, rinse, repeat, over and over, probably so they could sell a full CD tie-in. And I get that the attraction at Magic Kingdom is just a 20-minute concert of bears singing different songs, so it's kind of accurate on that account, but those songs in the attraction felt more memorable, and in the movie, all the filler that comes between these musical sequences doesn't cut it. I was hoping to hear some of the songs from the attraction in the movie as well, like some of the real deep-cut country western, but a lot of the music in the movie is barely even country. Any of the conflict that does arrive in the film is resolved way too quickly for you to even care, and there are characters introduced that serve no purpose other than to push the next song. The film overall isn't aggressively bad, so I was racking my brain trying to figure out why 8-year-old me was so appalled. Maybe I didn't like it because most of it was singing, and I was looking for more plot and comedy. But I've always liked musicals. Even growing up, I watched Sound of Music and Wizard of Oz constantly. I think the problem here is that the musical numbers are so generic and boring, and it just goes on way too long. It's like one of those mediocre bar shows your friend asks you to go to, and you don't know any of the tracks, so you're kind of just bored for 90 minutes. I'd like to preface this and say that the Haunted Mansion is my favorite Disney dark ride and probably my favorite theme park attraction of all time. I grew up watching this movie when it came out, and I was really looking forward to comparing it to the ride when I got home, as I had not seen the movie in almost 20 years. I'll also say that I can enjoy Eddie Murphy in almost anything, even mediocre family movies. And the family dynamic is what works best here in my opinion, as the setup is strong, showcasing the dad as a workaholic realtor who is missing his life in turn for a new sale. Even on his wedding anniversary, he can't give it up. To make up for it, he promises a weekend lake vacation, but even during this makeup vacation, he wants to stop for a potential client. Of course, this ends up being the mansion that's haunted. The Haunted Mansion, if you will. Despite familiar studio family movie trappings, there's some genuine care that went into the sets and practical effects, capturing the vibes and art direction of the ride fairly well. It can be very tactile. The score is pretty decent, being spooky enough and taking some of the themes from the attraction into its own style while still doing its own thing. The ghosts look pretty good, and I'm glad the zombies are practical costumes. I remember that sequence being fairly creepy as a kid. But despite all of this, I feel like the movie could have been a bit scarier, even with the PG rating limit. It should have been turned up a couple of notches, and some more thrilling sequences could have been implemented. They clearly chose Eddie Murphy so they could keep a partial comedic angle to offset some of the scary aspects of the movie, so parents would feel more comfortable taking their kids to see it. But they didn't take advantage of that offsetting enough, because there's plenty of room for more scares. Eddie Murphy isn't even the only source of levity. We also have Wallace Shawn as one of the servants, and then there's the matter of Madame Leota. I have to hand it to the casting director. Having Jennifer Tilly play Madame Leota is kind of a wild choice, but I respect it, and ultimately, I like it, despite it leading to the lighter tone I complained about. One of the main issues is that the other family members just aren't that interesting, especially the wife. And the two kids aren't the best actors, and sometimes it really undercuts the scene, as well as the performance Eddie Murphy's trying to give. That makes any scene that isn't focused on Eddie Murphy kind of a drag. If we're talking representation of the attraction itself, this one has a lot of the scenes, including the hitchhiking ghosts, the singing busts, the floating instruments, the purple wallpaper, and of course the bride, which is what the plot is leading to the whole time. And it's not that interesting of a conclusion. There should have been a stronger mystery. But by the end of it, Eddie Murphy's character gets to redeem himself, and the movie is only 90 minutes. 2 pluses in my book. It's slightly above okay, maybe worth watching if you have more than one Haunted Mansion themed accessory somewhere in your home. Finally, we get to something truly great. It probably comes as no surprise, but Pirates of the Caribbean is probably the best movie on this list, and I still watch the OG trilogy every couple of years. The franchise was a huge part of my childhood, and frankly, most people's childhood if you grew up in the early to mid 2000s. This was during a time when kids had a dozen different genres to choose from, many different franchises that were all different, like Harry Potter and Shrek, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, the Star Wars prequels, the Lord of the Rings, etc. You've got teen wizards, superheroes, elves, and Jedi. You might as well throw a couple pirates in the mix too. I assume this, Country Bears, and Haunted Mansion were all greenlit around the same time, so it's shocking to me that this one isn't studio blockbuster slop and is actually one of the most fun and well-crafted adventure movies of all time. It's also crazy to think how Disney would never put up the money now for just a straight up Pirates movie. Like, this was a huge wager for them to drop $140 million on. There are probably plenty of kids who don't realize Jack Sparrow didn't exist on the ride until after this film came out. Now he's a powerhouse of a recognizable IP that the company is hesitant to leave out while trying to move forward with a Pirates reboot. That one is still in the air. It's also refreshing to watch a blockbuster made at a time where you could still have cinematic and dynamic lighting, and you could see what was actually going on in the nighttime scenes. On top of that, we have thrilling and kinetic fight scenes that are well thought out, with each sequence having multiple stages to it, escalating the action in fun ways while keeping the audience on their toes. It's very easy these days for fight scenes, whether it's gunplay, fist fighting, or magic, to bleed together in a very boring way, and it can become so over the top and rely so heavily on quick edits that your eyes glaze over and you start to not care. The fight scene between Jack and Will inside the blacksmith forge has many moving components and different areas to the fight, and they banter back and forth in a way that develops their characters and the story without being in your face with it. The film doesn't capture as many scenes from the ride as, say, Haunted Mansion, but it captures the spirit and the fun of the ride very well, and it even has a few references here and there, like the dog and the key, and Mr. Gibbs passed out sleeping with pigs in the mud. I also like how smaller scale the adventure is, especially when you compare it to the sequels. Barbossa is a formidable yet likable villain who simply wants to end the undead curse him and his crew have obtained. You get an interesting view of their humanity, or lack thereof, when he explains that they haven't been able to touch or taste since they've been cursed, and perhaps immortality in this state isn't worth it. We also get a great dynamic of Will and Jack having to work together for different gains, and their chemistry is unmatched as Will tries to keep his moral high horse over piracy. They also give Elizabeth a bit of agency when she's captured, and she slowly becomes a stronger and more hardened female protagonist as the series goes on. To the kids watching, this was back when incels on the internet didn't cry over stuff like this, and it also didn't reek of corporate contrivance. This is at the heart of the definition of fun times at the movies, a true summer adventure that friends and family could have a blast seeing. Clearly Disney thought the same thing, as they granted Verbinski and Bruckheimer a 2-picture deal that would be shot back to back to make it a Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy. I'm kind of surprised they opted for the back-to-back filming, as The Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions didn't do as well as Warner Bros. Was probably hoping. Luckily, the Pirates team had more than enough to say with the 2 sequels, and it's incredible how much they were able to expand on with the world and the characters in just a few years. I think Dead Man's Chest and World's End are great blockbusters to study when it comes to world building. It's mind-boggling that they were able to connect together in a mostly successful and cohesive way. I can probably agree that overall the original is the best and most solid of the series, but to be truthful, I overwatched it growing up to the point where I actually preferred Dead Man's Chest, and I think this one is overall my favorite. I'd even say it's one of the best sequels of all time, and frankly, one of the best blockbusters ever made. It just oozes with style right off the bat, starting with a rainy wedding gone wrong and then transitioning to Jack Sparrow escaping pirate prison in the ways of burial at sea. The film sets up the theme and feeling running through the story that the age of the pirates is coming to an end, and the new villain Cutler Beckett is here to make sure of it. At the heart of the film is Will having to accept his lineage as he meets his father and realizes he's part of Davy Jones's crew, cursed to sail with him as a permanent fixture of the ship. Davy Jones alone is such a creative villain design, and the CGI still holds up shockingly well, and even puts some movies today to shame. I like that he's used as a connection to the sea itself, implying that there are rules and parts of the lore that we don't fully have a grasp on in this universe. I like that the old legends have their place here, and now it's a full-on fantasy, embracing the logic of the curse from the first movie but tenfold. Now there's a Kraken. You can use black magic to bring people back from the dead, and Davy Jones' locker is a real place. I love when worlds open up like this in a way that feels natural, but still feels very open-ended and doesn't explain too much. Every single set piece feels fresh and detailed, and unlike anything we'd ever seen before. We have Davy Jones' ship, which the interior looks like a reanimated, sunken version of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, complete with Davy Jones playing the organ, adding a surprising amount of sympathy to his character in the process. We have Tia Dalma's place. Every nook and cranny here is filled with detail. We have the island with the cannibals, in which we have a great sequence where Jack Sparrow is tied to a pole and has to escape, mixed with the hanging cages the crew is stuck in as they try to climb to safety. There's the Kraken sequences, which genuinely terrified me as a kid, as we get some true fantasy horror here, as the characters desperately have to fight off giant swinging tentacles. And towards the end of the film, we get a ridiculous sword fight on top of a spinning mill that breaks apart and starts flying down the jungle. All of these sequences are highly imaginative and thrilling in their own ways, and the film never feels repetitive. These scenes all have working parts and logical escalation. All of this adds up to such a fun movie that I'm afraid would have flopped if it would have came out today, because when critics are split on a movie these days, sometimes it can really dampen the hype. Thankfully, it was the film of the summer that everyone was talking about. And I remember going back to school that year and the lunchroom conversation was debating that if Jack Sparrow survived, how? The film is not without its flaws, and I think Jack Sparrow gets a little bit too silly at points, but he's so fun in the movie it's hard to get too mad. I think it does balance out though with the fairly serious scenes between him and Elizabeth, with her being the one to chain him to the boat so he can't escape like he always does, at last forcing him to face retribution for all the horrible and selfish deeds we've seen him commit so far. Overall, this one and World's End get dogged on for feeling overstuffed, but I disagree. I think this is a well-rounded adventure, and if you haven't seen it in a long time, I think you'll have a blast. Going in on World's End, I remember the consensus being that it wasn't really as focused as the second one, and that it was bloated, and some complained it was hard to follow. I thought I agreed with these going back in, but upon rewatch, I say that maybe it could have been slightly tighter, but not too much. It really doesn't feel that bloated to me, and for the length that it is, I think it accomplishes a ton, and it really feels like this huge epic and a fitting end to the trilogy. I don't know why people said there are too many subplots or that it was too hard to follow. I thought it was pretty straightforward. Cutler Beckett now controls the Seven Seas because he has the heart of Davy Jones. The pirates face extinction, so now they feel they must gather all the pirate lords to bring together the 9 pieces of 8. One of those pirate lords happens to be Jack Sparrow, so they have to save him first before they can all gather. To get to Jack Sparrow, they have to talk to Sao Fang, which sets up his death so that Elizabeth can become Pirate Lord. The only subplot isn't really a subplot. It's the B plot to the whole film set up by the last one, where Will wants to save his father's soul, which is on Davy Jones' ship, so of course that correlates with the A plot, and I think it's all very necessary. This one has my favorite opening of the 3, and it honestly still gives me chills. It's a great way to set the tone, and what a better way to show how dire it is for the pirates and how the age is coming to a close than to start with a mass hanging. Kudos to Disney for allowing Verbinski to start the film with a child solemnly singing before his own execution. The same level of detail and atmosphere are present here, and so are the insanely creative set pieces. This is immediately apparent as we ride with Elizabeth into Singapore and we get the bathhouse exchange with literal layers to the sequence, as half the crew has found their way below, ready to send up weapons when the time comes. Bringing Barbossa back from the dead doesn't fully sit right with me as an adult, and that might be because of so much Disney media has done this sort of thing ever since then, and I might have some sort of retroactive patrician PTSD from it. We'll call it Skywalker syndrome. But I suppose it's a good way to show that there's a level of magic in this world operating in ways we fully can't understand, which helps you buy Davy Jones' locker and the way that they get to it. But overall, I'm glad Barbossa is one of the key players in the film. He becomes this pretty neutral figure, being a leader when he needs to be and always being very knowledgeable of the pirate world and its lore. Full respect to the filmmakers for stopping the film flat to do a mildly experimental portrayal of Limbo and have Jack Sparrow talking to himself in an empty void. This is such an interesting sequence, especially when the stones turn to crabs and help him go where he needs to get to. It reminds me of another sequence from another third entry 2007 blockbuster, and it's when Spider-Man 3 has the sequence where Sandman forms into a functional sentient being. These kinds of sequences showcase the real creativity going on behind the scenes, and it's sensational to me when a $300 million movie can do this kind of stuff. It's not without its contribution to the plot though, because Jack continues to talk to himself after he leaves Davy Jones' locker, and it's a great way to actually get some character development out of him. And the crabs are a foreshadowing, as they're actually controlled by Tia Dalma, who is actually Calypso. I like that she is actually literally the heart of the film, and it ties everything together when you learn she's the reason Davy Jones carved out his own heart, and that they're in this mess in the first place. This rewatch, I was really thinking about how many different things are all connecting and have their place, and it's insane to me that they were able to connect everything with so much detail and expand the universe without sacrificing the plot. And how they come up with all of this for 2 massive screenplays in the year or so leading up to shooting is a real feat. Sequences I especially love are the meeting of the pirate lords, where you really get to see a compact slice of the 7 seas. It makes you think about all the adventures happening in the other oceans across the world. I love seeing the dead souls float by coming back from the locker. It's such a chilling yet beautiful representation of the afterlife, in a way that I could see old pirates really talking about in long passed down tales from their old adventures. I also really enjoy seeing Barbossa and Jack having a well-needed serious conversation about the world and the certainty of death. This is the grounding the film really needed. The climax is the main sequence that probably could have used some trimming down, but I think it's a lot of fun and I don't mind. This entry is probably the most CG heavy, with more processed looking frames and areas, and there's a bit of patchwork here and there, but when you see the scope of what's going on in the finale of the film, you kinda get it. The idea of having the ships face off in the middle of a maelstrom leads to a lot of fun ideas that might be too much for some, but I love seeing Jack swing around like crazy and fighting Jones on top of the ship. I think Will and Elizabeth getting married during the final battle is pretty apt for their characters. They stay quirky even in the most dire of situations. It becomes such an insane sequence, I can only imagine what went into the storyboard planning of it. There's some real satisfaction that Jack Sparrow chooses not to live forever, and he has Will stab the heart, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. So now Will can only come ashore every 10 years to see Elizabeth, which is tragic but poetic. But the real question is, would either of them truly mind if they had a respective side piece? I mean, come on, it's 10 years at sea. Plus, why can't he do the Davy Jones method and just have 2 buckets of seawater on the shore and stand in it? Or maybe just fill up your house with a whole floor of seawater. What's stopping him? Jokes aside, I need definite lore rules here, because that scene with Davy Jones drives me crazy. What's to stop him from placing like 5,000 buckets down and walking into town and having a drink? Overall, a bit flawed, but a hugely successful cap to a fantastic and fun trilogy of movies. It seems like a perfect place to stop. Surely there's no need to make any more. So naturally, Disney greenlit a 4th Pirates of the Caribbean, despite having a full and complete story with everyone's respective character arcs coming to a natural close. Oh wait, what's this? They teased the Fountain of Youth at the end of the 3rd one? How could anyone forget? Was this an actual teaser for a 4th film, or was it a fun way to show that Jack Sparrow will always be off on another adventure? Short answer, who cares? I'll say this, I kept an open mind about the idea of a solo Jack Sparrow movie before it came out. That's probably because I was a teenager in high school. When I originally saw it, I even gave it a modestly positive review, but then I didn't even watch it again. Years later, when the 5th one was coming out, I decided to revisit the 4th one, wondering why I never bothered to rewatch it, thinking maybe it's better than I had remembered. I was wrong. I was very wrong. On Stranger Tides is one of the most aggressively boring movies I have ever seen. I was not looking forward to watching it for a 3rd time for this video, I'll be straight up. But I somehow tricked myself into thinking, well, maybe I was just being cynical back then, and I'll just throw this on and treat it as a lazy Sunday kind of movie, and try to have some fun with it. No, it's just as boring and mediocre as I remembered. I have no issue with a new director taking on a franchise. Many have done so in the past to great results, and this one does have a different look and feel to it. I appreciate this one letting us get some new places like mainland England and Spain. That sort of feels refreshing, but it becomes clear very quickly that this new team doesn't know how to capture these new places well on camera. This film feels like one of the catalysts for the movement in the 2010s that pushed for more naturalistic lighting and aesthetics. I don't know why this was so popular. You lose a lot of atmosphere, and the images captured just look dull and uninteresting. It's not all bad. There's a couple of well-lit sequences, like when they're in the boat and the mermaids come about, but then there's plenty of other scenes where they're just this gray, drab look to everything, and it's annoying to look at. Another issue is that this crew does not shoot action in an interesting way like the other 3. There seems to be less stylization, and the stunts and choreography seem kind of stiff and basic. The film starts well enough, with Jack doing his thing and trying to slyly get out of trouble, but if they're going to make Jack the main character, then they need to reel him in a bit and make his character grounded again. Unfortunately, he's more Flanderized than ever. It feels like Johnny Depp at this point was just showing up to the set drunk, waving his arms around, squinting at people, and calling it a day. It's shocking how many things I didn't even remember, despite this being my 3rd watch, like Jack's dad showing up to save the day at the beginning. There's no setup for him to be just walking around London. He's just there, despite pirates being very illegal now, of course, and then he just literally disappears when he's no longer needed to the plot. I forgot that there's that sequence where Jack fights his double, leading to Penelope Cruz's character, who is so boring that all she enjoys doing in the film is spewing out mediocre exposition whenever she can. The last few movies built up such an interesting crew of characters on both the pirate sides and the Royal Navy. In this one we have Mr. Gibbs and Barbossa. Everyone else is bland and unremarkable. The new British lieutenant could have been any bloke they plucked off a street corner. It's that bad. Blackbeard himself would have been more interesting if he didn't have any supernatural abilities and no undead crew to actually set it apart from the other movies. But instead, it's just an even more generic crew, none of which stand out unlike Barbossa and Davy Jones' cronies. It's fine to have smaller stakes after such a massive trilogy, and having everything more grounded could have added to the world building of how the magic's slowly going out of the world and how the pirates are going away. Oh well. There's a religious cleric that they try to make one of the big new characters, which could have been an interesting angle, but there's just not much to him at all, and it's clear they wanted a younger Will Turner kind of character, to be safe, you know, but he spends the whole movie crying over this mermaid, and it's just not the same effect at all. And the whole attitude with the mermaid is so annoying in the film, like okay, she needs air, but everyone has to make it this big deal. Oh, and now she needs to walk, and they say, oh, we cannot stop. Why? You can't just stop for 2 minutes? Is there an actual countdown to when the Fountain of Youth expires? This kind of contention becomes very grating and annoying. There's a theme here, and I'm probably running this theme into the ground, but the movie is very uninteresting, so I apologize. There's a few scenes that I do actually like, by the way. Like I mentioned before, the scene where the mermaids surround the boat has great atmosphere and tension. It's lit really well. I also like Jack and Gibbs back and forths like usual. It really helps carry the spirit of the films into the movie. The detail that Jack really truly did love this woman is an added touch. Now, if only they could have ran with those kinds of emotions more regularly for Jack. Imagine if this movie truly made you care about that kind of stuff. I do like Jack's well-intentioned trickery at the end to save Penelope Cruz with the tear of the mermaid, so I'll give him that. The ending, though, just makes the whole thing seem kind of pointless. So, okay, he saves her, there's no eternal life for him, but now she's out of his life because he left her on an island. Nothing has changed whatsoever. I guess Barbossa got his ship again, that's something. The Fountain of Youth was destroyed, so maybe that's for the best, but the film just casually ends on Jack Gibbs talking about how he could live forever. But he's like, oh, I don't want to live forever actually, even though I pretty much already stated this at the end of World's End when I let Will stab the heart or whatever, you know. He just says this stuff to Gibbs and then suddenly it's over. I feel like it's a nothing sandwich. The whole movie might as well have been just him chilling on an island, taking a nap and drinking rum. I was so happy to take a break from Pirates and watch the Brad Bird film I missed when it came out. Going in, the critic and audience response perplexed me, as it was an even 50-50 from both sides. I'd never seen a response so perfectly split down the middle. I figured, well, it might have something to do with his politics, as some of his work gets interpreted at least as partial objectivism, which is well arguable in my opinion, and I don't think The Incredibles is an objectivist film. Did Brad Bird enjoy reading Atlas Shrugged? Most likely, but that doesn't mean that's what will be reflected in this movie. I'll also preface this by saying I love retrofuturism a lot, and now also Disney deep lore. So for the film to start out with a boy walking up to the 1964 World's Fair while A Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow is playing had me locked in, I can't lie. And for the entrance to this futuristic city being hidden inside of It's a Small World? Okay, this must have been engineered for me exclusively. I was pretty shook at this point. I was all in. If you don't know about the 1964 World's Fair, Walt Disney was a major contributor, making 4 attractions for the event with It's a Small World, Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, the Carousel of Progress, and Ford's Magic Skyway. All of these attractions made it back to Disneyland afterwards, except for Ford's Magic Skyway, which was scrapped, but some of the stuff, such as the dinosaurs, eventually made it into the Disneyland Railroad as a diorama. So the movie at first follows this young boy who apparently has invented a jetpack, and thinks it's worthy of inclusion at the Inventors Competition, but it doesn't seem to fully work yet. The girl at the booth likes his optimism and gives him a special pin that gets him into the transporter, and he makes it into the world of tomorrow. He gets into trouble immediately, but thankfully his jetpack works and he makes it to the ground level of this fantastical city, and we find out later that he was allowed to stay there through flashbacks. But that's my main problem with this movie, is that it stops here and shifts to focus on Casey, who's back living in our world. We just watched a kid discover this cool world, and instead of getting to explore it, we now have to sit and watch another kid discover it again. I get it, it's a mystery as to why George Clooney's character is so cynical and sad now, like what happened to the bright young fella he used to be and all that, but I feel like we could have at least spent a little more time with him as a kid and a young adult in Tomorrowland, and see him grow a bit and get a better grasp of the world and how the city actually works before going back to the much less interesting plot. No offense to this Casey girl, but it's just naturally going to be less interesting for me to watch her try to get to this place that she just gets a few glimpses of than to fully explore it. At least, this is just how my brain works. Most of this becomes a sort of road movie as she tries to figure out the secret of the pin that gives her these glimpses. There's at least some cool visual world building when she briefly gets to explore Tomorrowland while touching the pin. It's mostly fluff, but it's still cool because you can see a monorail system and how the people live and such, and aesthetically, it feels like a clever mix between retrofuturism and just straight up futurism. It looks like a possible evolution of the actual land from the parks. And I know Disney was worried that the real Tomorrowland would become outdated and that they would have to keep trying to catch up, but we've come so far now that it's okay to double down and lean into the mid-century take on the future. I feel bad for Disneyland's Tomorrowland though, because it's in a bit of a disarray. I think they could come up with a clever mix though, like this movie, and do a bit of an overhaul. Just an idea. Anyway, when she goes looking for the pin and talks to those 2 shopkeepers, that's when it starts to lose me a bit. I don't like the execution of these characters being audio animatronics with these goofy, futuristic Buzz Lightyear looking guns. It's too cartoony. It feels studio mandated, and it makes it feel tonally like a Disney Channel movie. I think if they were going to go this route, then it would have been cool to make the characters into actual high quality animatronics like you would see at the parks. Like, yeah, it's an expensive practical effect, sure, but imagine how cool it would be if they just look slightly off, and as you get closer, you start to see the slight jagged movement, and everything becomes totally uncanny, like the Na'vi attraction from River Journey. Maybe this movie could have had Clooney's time in Tomorrowland as the B plot and this Casey stuff as the A plot, and have us inch towards seeing his disillusionment the whole movie. And then when we finally do see it, it hits hard. But it never really feels that powerful in this film when we do see glimpses of it. I guess I really don't like that it takes over an hour to finally get back to Tomorrowland. And I genuinely like the concept that he created an invention that can tell you the day that you're going to die. But I feel like that would be more interesting if we would have seen that come about in Tomorrowland and get to watch the consequences of that invention unfold and see how people react. And have like a sequence, like maybe hold a giant scientist summit over it, really escalate things, have scientists and philosophers argue over it, make it get real Star Trek. I think that would be really interesting. But again, you have to appeal to 12-year-olds when making a Disney blockbuster, so unfortunately, this is not how it could be done. Instead, she and Clooney and the girl that turns out to be an android have to team up and get back to Tomorrowland, which we figure out is interdimensional, which makes sense. This takes us to probably my favorite concept from the film. I'm a huge fan of when movies have old world secrets and have implications that there have been advanced technologies and things going on for years and years before they should have. Powers that be, being in control of this secret knowledge, stuff like that. So mix that with old American history like light steampunk elements and you have my attention. Because in this movie, Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, and Jules Verne founded a secret society of futurists that found a realm where they could practice any kind of science without being prohibited by any one man or nation. These are all awesome ideas. I just wish the rest of the film came together a bit better. I like that when they do get to Tomorrowland, it's in disarray and seemingly abandoned. I really enjoy bleak sci-fi that paints a realistic idea of what's to come when humans play God. But it's a bit too vague about what happened to the actual city. Did the people go to another world, another dimension? Were people killed off? Could people not live with the possibility of knowing when you die? This could be a bit clearer, because in the movie it just makes everything feel empty and the stakes feel a little bit lesser. It really hits you over the head with the fatalism versus optimism stuff. But the idea is that humans have become complacent with the idea of their demise, so that's what's going to cause the end of the world, could be very powerful in the right hands. But the filmmakers here just don't deliver it in the right way, and it just doesn't feel as important as it should. I feel like Brad Bird wanted this movie in a meta way to inspire kids to invent and intellectually explore, but it pulls itself in too many directions. I hate to say this, but perhaps this could have been better as like a one-season limited series. And not that 6-episode BS they do on Disney Plus, but like a solid 12-episode season that had stronger writing and plot structuring and didn't have to appeal to 12-year-olds. I like that at the end it's clear they're going to rebuild Tomorrowland and make it better than before, but not strive for a perfect utopia. They make it clear that they're looking for dreamers, but that doesn't mean it's objectivist. Anyone can dream after all. There's some good stuff here, but I think it's definitely flawed. But it's much more worth your time than On Stranger Tides, I'll tell you that.
Karina!
I know what's ailing you, boy. You've got the unscratchable itch.
Is it just me, or was there very little fanfare leading up to this movie? I remember realizing just a month before it came out that there was a 5th Pirates movie on the way and feeling shocked because normally I follow movie-related news pretty closely. I may not have dug the last one, but it made so much money, especially overseas, I assumed more people would be talking about it. You would think by 2017 it would have been prime time for millennials to be overly nostalgic about the first film and that it would drive buzz for the new one, but no. I saw it the Saturday it came out and my auditorium was only a third full. Maybe the trailers just didn't look very interesting. Perhaps people felt burnt out after the 4th one. There could be 100 variables here. But it's so fascinating that this one just came and went. And yet the likes of Finding Dory, an equally forgettable cash grab, made exponentially more money. I think this film represents the early start of the soft reboot fatigue, only 2 years after The Force Awakens. That and the movie is pretty mediocre. It's only partially a pass the torch movie, but it still has the main aspects of it. We've got the son of one of the main characters on a quest, and he has to team up with one of his dad's old colleagues to save the day. And the young woman in the film is doing the exact same thing with her dad, she just doesn't know it yet. These two, Henry and Karina, aren't the most interesting nor charismatic. They don't hold a flame to Will or Elizabeth. But I can see why they were needed, because they know having another movie with just Jack Sparrow and Barbossa would not work at all. They needed the young blood. Unfortunately for the girl, this is the late 2010s, so now Disney mandates that you must be hit over the head with the fact that she's a strong, independent female character, and that she lives in a man's world where women can't do anything, instead of letting her actions speak for themselves like Elizabeth, who got to become more and more of a strong female leader over the length of a trilogy, without it being contrived.
But this map has never been seen nor read by any man.
Luckily, I'm a woman.
It's also really funny to me that they have a character that staunchly only believes in science and not fairy tales, and it's only been 20 years since Davy Jones. Henry has vowed to lift the curse on his father, who is still stuck sailing the Flying Dutchman, which is at least a nice driving plot point, and I like that it at least connects to the original trilogy without being an annoying rehash or callback. Unfortunately though, the villain Salazar is once again an undead captain with another undead crew with supernatural abilities. I always like Javier Bardem in anything, and he's alright here, but it just feels like more of the same, except the bad guys can run across water this time instead of under it. Jack Sparrow is still pretty flanderized in this one, but I'll give them credit. They at least have him at the end of his rope, legitimately at the lowest point in his life, and it's sad to see that he's willing to trade his compass for a drink. I feel like that since this is 20 years since World's End, it could have been interesting to make him maybe a bit more cautious and conniving with the way he goes about, since he is older, but I think they're too scared to develop him more than a tiny nudge. The film starts well enough, I guess, and there's about 4 or 5 sequences in this movie I liked, which is a leg up from the 1 or 2 scenes I liked from the 4th one. I enjoyed the first major action sequence where they pull the bank vault through the town by horses, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized it kind of rips off Fast 5 where they did the exact same thing but with cars. Despite those similarities, the sequence does work, and it's nice to see a lot of the old crew back with Gibbs, and I like that the crew has finally had enough when they weren't able to actually get any money out of the heist, which puts Jack in a sadder predicament. On a technical level, the color palette is an improvement. It's less murky and is allowed to have saturation. The action choreography is not as tight and kinetic as the originals, but it's still executed in a slightly better way than the 4th film. Paul McCartney has a cameo in this film for some reason, and they even gave him his own poster, which astounded me at the time, but these days it's become more and more common to do so. I mean, they put Kim Kardashian in a Paw Patrol movie just so she could advertise the movie on Instagram. Another sequence I thought was kind of clever was when Jack is going to be executed by guillotine, but is saved by his crew he didn't think cared for him anymore, and there's this great visual gag where the guillotine is being rotated around and he's powerless as the blade goes back and forth inches away from death. The rest of the movie is mostly just okay. I think what was missing was having a sequence where Henry and Karina are on their own together on a mini adventure and have to work together and start to play off of each other's personalities a bit. This could have strengthened their characters and relationship and would have been similar to how Will and Jack have to team up to save Elizabeth. The charisma is just not there though. In an attempt to make it fresh, they connect Salazar to Jack Sparrow, giving Sparrow an origin scene with the compass, which is fine, but I guess it has the signature uncanny Disney de-aging, and it drags the scene down for sure. And then they do the other Disney thing where all the unique things that Jack wears on his person were collected in this one moment instead of over time. You know, like a pirate. It's so dumb. Sounds like another Disney movie from 2017.
Solo.
Anyway, another major issue is that by the time Barbossa is reunited with Karina, which is his lost daughter, there's only 40 minutes left in the movie. They could have used a lot more time together, and it would have benefited the film if we explored their relationship, and it would have added much more weight to his sacrifice at the end. And speaking of the end, the final set piece is another crazy CGI fest, but it's decently creative, having the sea be split apart, but visually, it's pretty ugly. It still doesn't hold a flame to the original trilogy though, in the way that the stakes feel tangible and they actually make you care about Jack Sparrow's fate despite his less than savory moral compass. Here, I can mostly care less about the majority of the characters. That's not to say I don't feel a bit of satisfaction seeing Will and Elizabeth finally able to reunite in peace, with Will no longer bound to the Dutchman. Is it fully earned? That's up for debate. But I am shocked that people treat this one like it's way worse than the 4th one. It's definitely the easier watch. It's one of those okay 6 out of 10 adventure movies with a few good sequences and isn't the kind of film to get violently upset about. Or maybe it is. Maybe that's the thing. It pales in comparison of the original trilogy, and it might stand as the prime example of how things have changed, with Bruckheimer and Verbinski being able to take so many creative risks and craft such an off-the-wall spectacle of a story. And this one is in the throes of the new Disney era, where everything feels so mandated to hit specific beats that echo the originals while bringing very little freshness to the table. It's only been 7 years, but that was just the beginning of this horrific new era of blockbusters. It's safe to say that I'm all pirated out now. I could care less where Disney takes the franchise now. I don't think there's anything fresh they could do within this universe. I'd love to see another company give a Pirates movie a go, though.
This, however, seems remarkably like a paper I had the honor of refusing when it was submitted by a female writer.
This one is overall just pretty dull. We're in full Disney decline at this point, and it shows right off the bat with more shallow feminism hitting us over the head with how women can't do this, how women can't do that. Yeah, I think we know things were different 100 years ago. It's not that hard to figure out women were treated differently. Let's see it through the actions of the character just a little bit more than through just tacky dialogue. Please, just tip the scale just a little bit. I'm more than happy to watch well-written, strong female characters get stuff done. They just don't have to keep telling me that they're doing so. I was going to remark about how nice it was that the color palette was actually fairly colorful and vibrant, but as soon as we get to the jungle, we're smacked in the face with the piss filter and flat shadows. Comparing it to the ride, we get The Rock doing the skipper bits, and he does a fair amount of jokes from the attraction, but I don't really feel like they translate that well to an actual real jungle. The fun of the jokes come from the fact that you're actually in a theme park attraction, and some of the more purposely chintzy aspects add to it. I did notice that The Rock is an executive producer on their Behind the Attractions show, so I wonder how much he actually enjoys the Disney parks experience. I can't in all fairness call this performance a paycheck because of this, even if it's just The Rock barely outside of his usual character. One issue with the film is that it feels like they have a quota for action sequences. Perhaps they were worried that once the actual boat cruise part starts, that it would get repetitive or boring for general audiences. But I think it takes too long to actually get on the cruise itself. First, Frank has to fight a leopard. Then there's this giant chase sequence with Emily Blunt, and then they finally get onto the boat, but oh, here comes Jesse Plemons in one of the more one-dimensional villain roles in recent memory. They have to have an action sequence with him at the dock to remind you that he is right on their tail, and then finally, they can set off on their adventure. Plemons' character is pretty much just a mustache-twiddling German, and it's not interesting in the slightest. And if you waste Jesse Plemons, then you're doing something really wrong. I think the surprise of the film is that Blunt and The Rock have decent enough chemistry, and it makes the back and forths on the cruise part of the film fairly interesting. I like that The Rock's character has a layer of lies to him, and it actually adds to the plot, because there's this sequence where they're captured by wild natives, and I was at this point checking off adventure movie cliches, but it turns out they were in on it and it was all Frank's doing. But the lies don't end there. The most interesting reveal is that Frank is actually undead and has been around for 400 years. It's an element that actually caught me by surprise. The problem is, they mostly don't do much else interesting with this aspect. There's a whole group of undead conquistador snake dudes, because you have to have your creepy fantasy bad guys, but after watching 5 Pirates of the Caribbean movies with undead pirate crews that operate in a similar way, this just felt like more of the same. I don't know if that's my fault or Disney's, but I usually lean towards Disney's. But it felt very tired and I didn't care. Pair that with boring villain motivations and my eyes were starting to glaze over. That's until this insane creative decision where The Rock gives his backstory and they use this Metallica cover. I can't tell if I like it or if I hate it, and I'll try to show this clip without getting demonetized. You know what? Actually, it kind of rules. When you get into the last third of this film, you start to wonder why they had to stuff so many action sequences into the time before the actual cruise, because there's so much stuff in the back half that doesn't even take place on the cruise. Not that I was expecting it to that much, but I actually feel like there's too many action set pieces in this movie. The climax goes on for so long and I already barely cared about the characters' fates to begin with, so waiting for the film to wrap up felt like a task. It's probably on the same level as Dead Man Tell No Tales, maybe slightly better, but I guess Dead Man might edge it out for you if you're really into the established world of Pirates of the Caribbean, which is still inherently more interesting than Jungle Cruise on its own. I'd skip this one.
Just doing some final calculations here. Good news. No ghosts.
I had my hopes up for the new Haunted Mansion. The director seemed to really appreciate the attraction, and I thought surely this will be a big step up from Eddie Murphy's version, but to my shock, a lot of aspects of this film level it out to being pretty much on par with the 2003 version. There are a few aspects that are better. First and foremost, Lakeith Stanfield was so good in this movie that it felt out of place. Like his dramatic acting felt too good for a Disney ride movie. And watching him break down over his dead wife was almost surreal, especially when it's a movie that opens with "Welcome, foolish mortals." I also like Owen Wilson's phony priest character, and Rosario Dawson and her son managed to bring an emotional foundation to the film. We get some of the classic sounding score at the beginning, but it doesn't really keep through the whole movie. And as I predicted, as soon as we get to a major nighttime scene, we get that really dark blue hued naturalistic look that plagues modern movies. The main problem with the film is that it's over 2 hours, and it does not need to be. A lot of the middle of the film just feels like characters are standing around and not doing all that much. The Hatbox Ghost being the villain could have been done way better, or just not at all. It just felt like dumb fan service that added up to a stupid CGI villain, when the film could have used a bit more heart in this area, a real human playing the villain to ground it a bit. At least in the Eddie Murphy version, we get a sense of tragedy with the driving force of the plot being Grady wanting to be reunited with his long-lost wife. I promise, most people going to see this movie would have not cared one way or another about the Hatbox Ghost, let alone know who he was before he was forced back into the attraction half a century later. They could have used him in like one sequence as a side scare or something. I want to go more into his poor placement in the Magic Kingdom version of the attraction, but I'll let that go for now. Another problem is that we didn't need so many characters. Danny DeVito's presence is always nice, but he just feels like he's there for one specific plot moment and not much else. Jamie Lee Curtis is fine as Madame Leota, but I surprisingly like the crazy choice of Jennifer Tilly from the original. Tiffany Haddish in this movie is mostly just annoying, and she as a person is very problematic, so you know. But there's this weird decision of humor that stems from mostly her character that comes off bizarre. And the joke is that they just name specifically branded items. That's the joke. Unless I'm just not understanding the bit.
The only thing available to us is this French vanilla Yankee candle.
She forgot to cancel her Amazon subscription, so now we have all these specific product names. Okay?
Sage from Costco.
And as if the film couldn't be long enough, instead of condensing in areas that would be obvious, they drag out the script and make half of the crew drop everything, pause, and go to a completely different haunted mansion miles and miles away just so they can retrieve something that they needed because, oh, the Hatbox Ghost has to have the right hat. No, it's not in this mansion, but another mansion. It's so unnecessary. I feel like the film would have been better if it would have taken the PG-13 rating it already had and decided to push into actual PG-13 horror and actually be spooky, but they're always too scared to do so. The whole film should have taken place over one very long haunted night, and it could have been detailed in a way where a smaller group of people have to go room to room in a mansion that truly feels like a deep maze of rooms and ghosts. Make them solve smaller mysteries before unveiling a big mystery as they work their way towards like the top floor or something. They hit certain sequences of the ride, but it doesn't feel very cohesive in the way that they come about. They should have just focused on the bride as the villain and had some sort of Conjuring 2 situation or something. Overall, this one's alright. It's better than the couple of movies I just talked about, but still pretty disappointing. Out of all of these movies, the original Pirates trilogy is the clear winner here. I'm not even sure if that came of any surprise to any of you. But if you're going off how many actual aspects of the ride made it into the movie, then I guess the Haunted Mansion movies get that award. Alright, wow, we made it. We're done. To wrap things up, I'd like to say that I'd love to see the upcoming Space Mountain take inspiration from Disney's history and do a sort of retro-futuristic 70s sci-fi throwback, an homage to the black hole era, but I know they will probably not do anything close to that. If we ever get a Disney attraction film that's over a 7 out of 10 again, I will be the first to let you know. Thanks for watching. Perhaps subscribe if you want to see more essays like this. We also have a long-form discussion show called The Harbor where we discuss real cinema if you'd like some hearty cinematic sustenance. Other than that, the moral of the video is, go pop some popcorn and watch Dead Man's Chest.
How did you get here?
Sea turtles, mate.